talking about Russia, and for E period, you're going to be starting right here, and we're going to be discussing the rise of absolutism in Russia, okay? And we're going to talk about the rise of absolutism in Russia pretty early on. When you look at things in like a historical context, you have to understand that, ironically enough, do we talk about Louis XIV kind of midway through this unit as being the pinnacle of absolutism? We do, because he is, right? Like, he really, really, truly is the pinnacle of absolutism. But it doesn't mean he was the first one, right? Like, so he was not the very first absolutist ruler of in all of Europe. He actually was not superseded. He actually was preceded by this guy that we're about to talk about. None other than a guy by the name of Ivan, right? So Ivan was the very first Tsar of Russia. But the thing is, though, is we start our story about Ivan off in the late 1500s, right? Our story about Ivan begins in the late 1500s after Russia has just recently become what you would consider Russia, right? Like, so Russia actually going into it is relatively a new country, okay? So when you're talking about the growth of Russia in European history, you have to understand that the Mongolians actually ruled over that territory that you now call Russia for over 100 years. This thing called the Golden Horde that was led by this guy named Genghis Khan actually conquered the entirety of the area that you know as modern-day Russia, Siberia, and areas of northern China. Some of y'all know very, very well the Great Wall of China was actually built to keep the Mongolians out. So going into that, though, there were these people that lived in the western reaches of like this area that they took over, right? And they were actually Europeans, and these Europeans referred to themselves, or they considered themselves Europeans, and we now consider them Europeans as well. So going into it, even though Europe's not really a continent, it's actually technically Eurasia, but we're not going to get into that right now. But what they're going to begin to do is break away from that Mongolian territory and empire. And it's all going to start off with this guy named Ivan III, who was known as the Grand Prince of Moscow, right? And at the time, it wasn't even, like, Moscow, by the way, is the largest city in Russia, the oldest city in its current capital. But at the time, it was called the Kingdom of Muscovy, right? And so he breaks that land away and begins to push the Mongols out, establishing a new little kingdom that would eventually grow into what is called Russia, right? But notice his title. Ivan III was the Grand Prince of Moscow. He wasn't anything big, and especially wasn't the king of anything. And so as they begin to actually like liberate some of that territory from the Mongolians, they split that land up and they begin to give it to nobles, right? And so what is going to end up happening is Russia is going to grow very, very large, very, very quickly. And so during the late 1500s, Russia is clinging to feudalism, okay? So ironically enough, whereas the rest of Europe, Western Europe, is seeing a downfall in feudalism because it's becoming more and more inefficient, and you're seeing the growth of economies and like interstate commerce and the growth of technology and infrastructure in Western Europe, by the late 1500s, you're going to be seeing actually a clinging and solidification of feudalism because places like Russia didn't have access to like ports that were actually not frozen for a big part of the year because it was so cold out that way. And then also, they just don't have a lot of territorial access to port areas in general. So going into it, that you need to understand is that the Russians really needed their feudal system, so they clung to it very, very aggressively. But going on to it, though, Ivan III, the Grand Prince of Moscow, would die. He would have a son named, Vasily, right? And then, like, that guy is going to be the Grand Prince of Moscow, but it's going to be Vasily's son, or Ivan III's grandson, that will become the very first absolutist, probably, that Europe has ever seen. And his name is Ivan IV, a.k.a. Ivan the Terrible, right? Like, known famously as Ivan the Terrible. He was going to come along, and actually, as Russia began to grow very, very large, and these feudal estates began to grow, he's going to consolidate all of them under one ruling monarchy and becomes their very first unifying government force. He comes in and becomes what is known as the first Tsar of Russia. Notice that word right there, C-Z-A-R, right? He is the Tsar of Russia. Also, notice that word right there, C-Z-A-R. Where do you think that word comes from? Caesar, right? So like that's what Russians refer to their kings as, is a czar. So when he centralized his government and named himself the Tsar of Russia, he became that very first solidifying Russian king, creating the kingdom that you now know of as Russia. So going into it though, he actually is going to be consolidating all those nobles under one unifying government. Those nobles are known as the boyars, right? Like, so in Russia, you refer to a noble as a boyar. Now, interesting little fact about this whole thing, though, is The boyars tend to call this guy Ivan. They're the ones who referred to him as the Terrible. Now, why would the boyars call this man the Terrible? Why would they refer to this guy who looks super nice, you know, in his big furry coat and also his really big beard that's emblematic of Russian men, standing in front right there of St. Basil's Cathedral, the cathedral that was famously built underneath his reign? Why would they call him the Terrible? Well, that seems so mean. Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that he stripped power from them, right? When he actually consolidates the government under one ruling body, following his coronation ceremony when he was 15 years old, when they literally rained gold coins down on top of him while they put the crown on his head, which is the most obnoxious boy-sounding thing I've ever heard in my life, he is going to begin a campaign of taking power away from them and giving it to himself, creating an absolute government inside of Russia, and he's going to do this by 1547 when he's actually coronated, okay? So by 1547 when he's coronated, this is actually that's over 100 years before Louis XIV ever really begins to grow in power, and also before he's even born, all right? So now, going into it, though, but again, he's called the Terrible because he stripped power away from people. But history books would not continue to call somebody terrible just because he stripped power away from someone. That's ridiculous, right? Why would they refer to him as the Terrible? A lot of it had to do with Ivan's personality. Ivan apparently, what we believe, may have been undiagnosed bipolar or had some type of mental, mental illness of some type that we're not really sure and can't identify because he's been dead for a really long time. So going into it, we have to understand that Ivan was apparently very prone to violent fits of rage, right? Violent fits of rage, even as a young kid and stuff like that, where he would go from super happy to super mad or super sad to super laughter or out of nowhere. And he was just all over the map. Now, he's got some pretty famous stories about him that have to actually do with his temperamental rage. For example, St. Basil's Cathedral, which is actually famously pictured right here, is a cathedral that there's a legend that says that when actual Ivan the Terrible had this cathedral built inside of Moscow, he actually was so impressed by this cathedral that he had the architect's eyes burned out after the fact because he didn't want anyone else to have one, right? So that, for example, isn't a good one. Another big famous one as well is one time apparently he had one of his best friend's tongues cut out because he thought he was talking too much, right? So as you can see though, Ivan, pretty big fits of rage. Now, ironically enough, during this time period, there wasn't any kind of medicine that you could take to actually stop the progression of these kind of violent fits of rage and stuff like that. Now, there is medicine, though, that Ivan did find. Ivan found apparently some medicine that was apparently able to give him a more temperamental nature and was able to kind of prevent him from flying off the handle randomly. It was a woman, actually, right? So now, the thing about it, though, is her name, it's very famous. And for some of y'all, you might go, because her name was Anastasia Romanova. Exactly. That right there, she's the very first Romanov to get married into the royal family, right? And some of you in the room are I have no idea who the Romanovs are, because you don't read enough books and stuff. But the thing about it, though, is that some of you do know who the Romanovs are, and that's how they get integrated into the Russian royal monarchy. So going into it, though, but Anastasia had the ability, apparently, to keep him calm sometimes, right? After he, cut his buddy's tongue out, apparently, she was like, Ivan, why would you do that? That was mean. And he was like, I'm sorry. So, and he apparently apologized and then promoted his friend, actually to a new position and gave him more money, right? Tongueless. Now, going into it, though, is Anastasia and him were actually apparently very happy, and they met each other at a very young age. Ivan met her when she was 15. He was 16, right? There was a very, no, crazy age gap. They loved each other uncontrollably as well. So much so that they had several children. 2 daughters that unfortunately died in infancy. 1 other son that died at 8 months old. But they had 2 surviving sons that are going to be very important to this story, right? And one of them, the first one, his name was Ivan, right? And we'll call him Ivan Jr. for the sake of the story, right? And he looked a little bit like this. Is one of the only surviving images of him and stuff like that. But that's him right there, Ivan Jr., who would later on become Ivan V, all right? And that's Ivan the Terrible right there, triumphantly riding on the back of his horse with his son and stuff like that. And Ivan Jr. would actually grow up to be strong and handsome and athletic and really well educated, well read, and looked like he was going to grow to be one of the best kings that Europe has seen in a long time, right? Everybody was excited for him to become czar because his dad was pretty well known for cutting people's tongues out and burning eyeballs out and doing a lot of other stuff too. He also even had a secret police, like Ivan the Terrible had a secret police. He like dressed a guy up that like wrote a newspaper article about him as him and then stabbed him to death. So like thing about it though is Ivan, Ivan Jr. seemed like everybody was going to be okay though. And then he had one other son, right? And poor little, he had Fedor. So yeah, this son's name is Fedor, spelled Feodor, right? So now Fedor though, we're not sure for sure, but there are accounts, and some historians believe that Fedor might have actually been someone who might have had general autism disorder, right? Or he might have actually been on the spectrum somewhere, because Fedor had a very, very hard time connecting with people. He really couldn't have like long conversations with people. He didn't really understand emotional connection. He would spend hours a day inside of his room reading his Bible. He would pray really often all the time. He didn't really like to sit with his family when they had meals. He also was known as Fedor the Bell Ringer, because one of the one things he loved to do when he would leave his room was to go to churches at the time when the bells would ring, and he would ask the priest to allow him to ring the bells for them, right? So he's a very, very good person, a very nice person, and stuff like that, but not somebody you necessarily want ruling Russia, right? So going into it though, what's going to end up happening is as this entire thing continues to progress forward, everybody is seeing Ivan the Terrible get very, very aggressive and stuff like that, but something randomly happens when the boys are pretty young. Anastasia dies, right? Like, so she dies, and Ivan has just now lost his medicine, right? Has lost his like thing that's going to keep him calm, that's going to keep him happy and stuff like that. And of course, his wife is now dead, and he's convinced that the Boyars killed her, right? He's convinced that the Boyars had her like poisoned with mercury or something like that, and he like says this until the day he dies, that my one true love was murdered by the Boyars. He begins a campaign of like burning down like Russian villages and like all this other stuff as well because of this moment. Now going into it though as well, you need to understand what ends up happening next. Do we actually have medical records now or medical analysis of Anastasia Romanova's body in the modern era? We do. And modern day medical records actually indicate the chances are is that she might have actually been poisoned, because there is actually trace amounts of arsenic and mercury inside of her system. So we believe that Ivan was right the entire time, right? But remember, he lost her, right? And since he lost her, those violent fits of rage are going to come back, right? And then he begins his whole campaign of burning down boyar villages, starting a secret police, killing lots of people and stuff like that. And everybody's freaking out, and they're like, if this guy could just die so Ivan Jr. could become king, everybody would be better off. Well, then came one crazy night, right? One crazy night where Ivan Jr.'s new wife, right? Ivan actually Jr. got married by this point, and Fedor are all eating a family meal together, right? Fedor's sitting at the end of the table and stuff like that, and then, of course, Ivan Jr. is sitting up close to his dad. Now, what he hasn't told his father yet is his wife is pregnant, right? His wife is pregnant, and she's only about a couple of months along, but her body is beginning to change, right? But they didn't want to tell anybody because it's the 1500s, y'all. You don't want to tell anybody because, like, like something could happen to the pregnancy. I mean, like, look at Ivan himself. He had three kids die before they saw a year old, right? So they didn't really want to say anything. But her body was beginning to change, right? And apparently, Ivan the Terrible got up from the dinner table, and because her dress was too tight, he walked up to her and said, "How dare you come to my table dressed like that?" And he beat her in front of his son, and she had a miscarriage, right? So he beat her in front of his own child. She ends up having a miscarriage, which sets Ivan Jr. off. And Ivan Jr. goes up to his dad inside of his throne room and begins to yell and scream at him, right? Screams and yells at him. He goes, "Everybody can't wait for you to die just so I can become czar," right? Nobody likes you. Nobody wants you around anymore. All of us are looking forward to the day that you're not here. And then Ivan the Terrible, with a blank face, apparently then just picked up his scepter, turned it sideways, and then stabbed his son in the side of the head with it, right? Literally, there's a painting of this moment. He killed his son, just boom, just stabs it in the side of his head, killing him instantly, right? Ivan Jr. falls down to the floor, and then apparently Ivan the Terrible threw the scepter down, walked down, picked up his son's body and held it close and began to cry, right? Because apparently, again, this is that swinging of emotion and stuff like that, but he's just killed his son. But y'all, really quick though, what does it mean that, who's going to take over now that Ivan Jr.'s dead, and when Ivan the Terrible dies, it's going to be Fedor, right? And so Fedor ends up taking over right after Ivan the Terrible dies, and Fedor does get married, and Fedor does never have kids, right? He never has children with his wife and stuff like that. We don't even know if their marriage was actually even officially sealed and stuff like that because he literally just struggled with like having that emotional connection. And when Fedor eventually dies, the Rurikid dynasty of Ivan the Terrible dies out. And when his dynasty dies out in 1613, the Romanov family takes over, right? And that is the Anastasia's descendants, and of course the cousins of Ivan Jr. and Fedor, right? So that dynasty takes over in 1613, and the Romanov family would rule over Russia from 1613 all the way up till 1917, which is absolutely wild.